You got any recent interesting real estate stories?
Well, yeah, so we just sold a house in the eastern part of the county, and on the survey there was no mention of a graveyard, but on the perk permit, a previous agent had written cemetery on the perk permit. And this is like a 9.5 acre piece of property. So, a fairly large piece of property.
So this was found when the buyer was doing their due diligence?
This was revealed by us as part of our company policy. We have perk permits on our documents. So that's something that we do differently than other firms. So if we say it's a 4-bedroom house, you have the perk permit, and we want people to know the schematic.
So you're the seller.
We represent the seller, and so we have this information on the airwaves. It's on the internet. It's easily accessible for a buyer or for the other agent. We want to make this as smooth as possible. And so the buyer's agent asked and said, "Yeah, Eric, our people want to put in pasture, do a horse property, convert some of this wooden land, but they're concerned about the cemetery on the perk permit. Do you think you could have the seller locate that?" I'm like, "Sure, okay." And because the previous agent, the developer agent, another fellow land guy in the county, really, really good guy, I was like, "Well, let me call him up first." And so I call him up, and he's like, this guy's going back on 15 years memory. And he's like, "Yeah, I vaguely remember that one. Yes, we did disclose it on the perk permit." He's like, "I think it was somewhere around 6 to 8 grave sites." And I was like, "Oh, well, that's, on a 9.5 acre piece. We're talking, 500,000 square feet of property. 10, 30 square feet's not going to make a big difference. I'm sure you can make pasture around it." So I tell my seller's like, "Sure, no problem. I know exactly where it is. I'll go mark it off." And that way the buyers can see it. And the seller calls up and he's like, "Eric, I think I found it, but I'm not sure." I was like, "Well, this is important. I want to make sure that you found the right thing." And he based it off the schematic of that perk permit. Sure enough, I go out there. Guy he's an engineer, did a lovely job. He had poles with tennis balls and yellow string, and he had this little area marked out. And having been a land guy in Chatham County, we know what to look for. So wild that here we are going through COVID-19. The main reason why I have grave sites on rural property is because of the Spanish flu. So you'll see all these beautifully marked cemeteries with these nice headstones, and they'll have carvings in them from the 1800s and sometimes the 1900s, and they're fairly nice stones because that's what people did. They buried themselves on their farms, and then like 1914 to 1922, there's like this gap when the Spanish flu came, and it's just little rocks and indentations in the ground. So they had so many deaths with the Spanish flu that some of them are not as well marked. So anyways, I go out there. He's got his 4 tennis balls and his poles out there, and I look down and I'm like, "Hey, what do you got?" And he's like, "See, right there." And it's just 2 rocks laying down on the ground. Like each the size of a football. And I'm like, "Yeah, that's not it." And he's like, "Well, how do you know what you're looking for?" And it's that old joke. I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it. And I said, "Well, first of all, we're looking for rocks that are standing up. That just couldn't possibly have happened in nature. And then you're looking for a 2.5 wide dent, 4 to 7 feet long." I mean, that's it. And sometimes there's a foot. Not only is there a headstone, but sometimes there's a footstone as well. And I said it's usually on a hilltop or whatever. So we walked this entire 9.5 acres. And I'm going from hilltop to hilltop to hilltop. And he's like, "Here's a rock," and I'm like, "Yeah, it's just a rock." And there's a small stream going through the property. I'm like, "Yeah, they never buried anybody on a stream. It was always on a hilltop." And so we walked the entire property and everything, and we get back, and I go, "Yeah, like that. That's what we're looking for." And sure enough, there's a rock that's standing up straight like that. And I was like, that actually might be a grave and everything. And then I start looking around, and sure enough, there's that 2.5 foot wide dent, 6 feet long. And we get to looking around and everything. You know, there's trees coming up and everything. And instead of like 6 to 8, there's like 20 to 25.
Oh.
And I'm guessing it was mid 1800s. They've definitely they've been there for a long, long time. I'm sure there's not anything left. I mean, there's certainly no coffin or bones or whatever, but you know, still want to be respectful of the area. North Carolina has specific visitation rights for the family or whatever. There's no way to tell that there's a family there. So the seller's an engineer. His daughter is actually a math teacher, and he's like, "So what do you think the square footage is here?" And I'm like, "It's an oval. I don't know. I don't remember how to do oval from high school or whatever." And he's like, "Oh, I know how to do oval." And so they mark it out, and it was a little bit over 1/10 of an acre. I think it was like 0.15 or whatever, so like 1/8 of an acre. But it was an area that we have to avoid. Didn't know if this was going to be a concern to the buyer. The buyer came out. It really wasn't, a big issue to them or whatever. And but yeah, and then another time I had a piece of land out in Silk Hope, and this was the black iron fence with some 6 and 7 foot tall headstones, and that was a prominent family in the Silk Hope area, and they still went out there on a regular basis and weeded it around and cleaned up and everything. And so that was 17 acres. We're talking about New Jersey clients. This guy was from New Jersey. 17 acres. This was a long time ago. I think the 17 acres at the time was probably worth $100,000. I priced the 17 acres for $75,000. So people would call up and say, "Why is this land so cheap?" And I'm like, "Well, it's got a cemetery in the middle of it." Click. I mean, people hang up all. This guy from New Jersey calls up. He's like, "Why is this land so cheap?" And I'm like, It's got a cemetery in the middle." He's like, "So what does that mean?" I go, "Well, you can't ever take it down, and you have to let the family visit and everything." He's like, "Is that it?" I'm like, "Yep." He's like, "All right, I'm gonna buy it." So he buys it. He builds a house out there. I see him like a year or two later, and I'm like, "Hey, how'd it go with that? You built a house?" He's like, "Yeah, I built a house." And I said, "Are you happy out there?" He's like, "I love it out there." And I was like, "And the cemetery, has that been an issue?" He's like, "Quietest neighbors I've ever had." So, and then sure enough, I did another one out in Durham, in the middle of Durham, and this was in a nice little subdivision and everything, and they had some between them and a big power line easement. And they're like, "What do we do about that?" And I was like, we just disclose it. And that house sold in 5 days. It wasn't a big deal at all. So, we do have them. And then I just sold a house last month. This is real estate for you. We're talking grave stories. And so I sold a house last month, and there's this giant mound in the middle of the backyard, like really big. And I get a couple calls, and I'm like, "I don't know, it's just a mound. It's not a big deal," and everything. And so another agent calls and says, "I really want to know what that mound is." And I'm like, "Fine." And so I call the seller. I'm saying New Jersey all the time. The seller's from New Jersey. Paul from New Jersey. And his brother actually lives in Pittsburgh, and his brother's a mailman. and his brother lives across the street. And he's like, yeah, I know what that is. I'm like, what is it? And he's like, it's where the lady's horse died. They buried the horse in the back. I'm like, no, they buried the horse. So it's this huge mound of where they buried a horse in the background. And so then I had to tell all day. And the lady that bought it, she's like, yeah, I'm fine with it. That's no problem. I mean, it was like 8 acres. So, it's just an area that you avoid or grow tomatoes or something.